to answer all the post-lab questions that you can, given what you saw in class. Remember, I showed you in the front an example of a color gradient based on milk concentration, and I showed you in the front what happens when you shake a white one, a blue one that's already turned white. Are there any questions about the post-lab, which is due tomorrow? Yes?
What if you were absent?
You would need to get data from somebody else. Anybody else? Anybody have poison oak yet?
I'm really paranoid.
Yeah, I guess not. You would probably know already.
I wish. Oh yeah.
You can check. It should be showing up like right now. Bottoms of your arms, ears, neck, ankles.
I have it on my head, shoulder.
I have a little bit on my ankle, my right ankle.
Really?
Teeny bit. Okay. Now, students, this is the beginning of assignment 8.4. I have a video that I often show to my students during class, but this year I chose to skip that video. So instead, I'll just tell you the story of what happened during these years. And kids, when you switch seats, you just have to please let me know. It really slows down my attendance taking when you switch seats. Okay. So, a few interesting facts for you about the Colorado River. Number one, it's one of the world's largest. This is more than 1,000 miles long. It is America's siltiest and warmest river. More than 30 million Americans depend on the Colorado as their primary water and electricity source. And that includes 10 of America's largest cities. I'll give you a little bit of history before 1857. Before 1857, you may know that the last uncharted land in the United States was up here. You've heard of the Lewis and Clark expedition that mapped the Pacific Northwest in the early 1800s. You may know that we mapped the Nevada and Sierra Nevada in California, the White Mountains in Nevada and the Sierra Nevada in California, during the 1840s as part of the gold rush. And coincidentally, the last blank space on the map in the United States national map was a few sections of the Colorado River, where you know there's a river down there, but you can't quite connect it to other areas of the river or near the river because you can't see the bottom. Are you lurking right now?
No, well,
Fish. Just chilling. Feel free to sit, but I
Yeah.
watch it.
that door was closed, so I just
Okay.
you can sit there.
The Colorado River was the last unmapped region of the United States. In 1857, the first year, some dude named Joseph Christmas Ives. His middle name, yes, was Christmas. His last name is Ives. Joseph Ives explored around the edges of the canyon and said, you know, he tried to explore the river and he said, I don't think it's passable. He declared the Colorado River inaccessible. He said it would never be mapped. Nobody will ever give you the elevations of the water because it's impossible to reach parts of this river. You may know that there was a little conflict in the United States during the early 1860s. A little thing called the Civil War. There's a lot of stories about the Civil War that you should probably know about, but there was this one guy named John Wesley Powell, who coincidentally is related to the West Powell that you all know. Is an ancestor of the Wesley Powell that you all know. By the way, how many of you know Wesley Powell? That guy has a mad, proud pedigree. So Wesley Powell was a decorated officer during the Civil War until somebody blew off one of his arms. And he was forced into early retirement because by the time he was healed, the war was over. So I believe it was his left arm that was blown off during the Civil War. Forced him into an early retirement because they didn't need his services by the time that his arm was fixed. And so John Wesley Powell, I guess, looking for something to do in his retirement, said, yes, I've heard it's impassable, but I'll go for it. And rather than take his, what do they call it, the retirement and go sit around in his patio, he decided that he would try to map the Colorado River. The federal government's like, yeah, bro, you're pretty hardcore, go for it. And in 1869, John Wesley Powell became the first and only person to navigate the entire Colorado River with his one arm. Now, he had a team of something like 20 people. A bunch of boats, porters, cooks, soldiers to help fight off the angry Indians, and so on. But not a single one of them completed the whole journey. If they started, none of them finished. And if they finished, none were there at the beginning. Because everybody either died or quit on him. He was the only person that actually went from the top to the bottom. Now, legend says that his crew would say, sorry, bro, we're tired of losing coworkers. This is too gnarly. And he'd go, well, you're all a bunch of wimps. So he would stand up on the sides of these big wooden rowboats. He would ask them to lash the rope to his good arm. And then say, okay, thanks, push me in. I'll see you guys downriver. And they would just push him into the rapids. And he would charge solo. You know, I guess, steering like this and pulling up on the front end. I don't know. His crew would go up the canyon, walk around, come down the canyon, and find him camped out on the beach. Or find his boat all shattered and his head cracked open on a rock, like floating in shallow water. But John Wesley Powell was the first person ever to go from the very top of the Colorado, somewhere in northern Colorado, Fort Collins, all the way down to the Mexican border. This was the last part added to the American map. He came back to a hero's welcome. Everybody who worked under him said he was heroic and godlike. When he reported to whoever he reports to, I don't know, Congress or something, they said, so, Mr. Powell, how's the Colorado River? And he said, it's too gnarly, it's too wild, it's too rugged, it's too extreme. We cannot develop the Colorado River. And everybody said, but it's got a lot of water, right? And he said, yeah, exactly. It's got so much water that when it gets steep and burly, it's just too gnarly. Too much sediment, too many rocks, too many drops, too many rapids, too many box canyons where there's no shore. It's just flood waters with walls on the side so you can't get out. He says it's too gnarly. We should never build it. And I guess the only part that Congress heard was a lot of water. Because they said, thank you for your service, Mr. Powell. See you around. And then they immediately started plans to develop the Colorado River. To start building dams to control the water. In 1922, there was a lot of excitement. Now that they had a good map, now that there was a lot of development in the Southwest, by development here I mean houses, yeah. So as the Southwest started to grow, people said, hey, you know, we got a map and there's a lot of water, let's start controlling this river. And 1922 is a really famous year. It's called the Hoover Allocation. This was an agreement between states along the river to decide how much water they would take out of the river. What was it President Herbert Hoover? Is that right?
Yeah.
Herbie Hoover?
Herbert.
President Herbert Hoover presided over what is considered to be the most catastrophic allocation of water ever. He said, mountain states, you can get half. Lower states, you can get half. And when there's extra, we'll give some to Mexico. These are the mountain states, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah. The lower states are California, Nevada, Arizona. And to me, this is like Santa Claus. I keep hearing the story, but it just doesn't make sense to me. I've read this in books, I've seen it in documentaries, I've heard it in lectures when I was at university, but it doesn't make sense to me. Instead of giving them an actual percentage, they gave them a gallon total. And 1922, by coincidence, was one of the wettest years in the record of the Colorado River. Meaning, you're one of my favorite children, you're one of my favorite children. I'll give you half my money forever, I'll give you half my money forever. I made 100 grand this year, so you get 50 grand and you get 50 grand forever. What happens if I get a pay cut next year? I owe money, right? So I promised her 50, I promised her 50. And I'm saying dollar values, not percentages. You know what I'm saying?
They didn't find the average.
So they didn't find the average. They didn't make it a percentage. They said, look, we got tons of water. You know, we're going to start building dams. That means we're going to have tons and tons of water. So let's just call it half of the rain we got this year will go to these guys, and half the rain will go to these guys. And I forget the numbers, but let's call it 100 gallons for the mountains, 100 gallons for the lower states. And hey, we got like 220 this year. Let's call it 20 for Mexico. It doesn't make sense to me. Why not just call it a percentage? But somehow in the planning and calculating the size of the dams and the state share of the money and the state share of the water supply, they had to put a gallon number on it. And it's never rained as much as it did that year, or almost never. So they said, I promise you'll get 100, I promise you'll get 100, and I guess we'll give Mexico like 20. And then every year since then, nobody's ever gotten their allocation, so there's always been these legal conflicts. Where the mountain states say, I get to keep more because we promised that I'd get 100. And then the lower states sue everybody and say, no, 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 I've been promised 100. And then Mexico sues the U.S. and says, wait a minute, you promised us 20 a year. And there's just never been enough to meet the allocations. This is Santa Claus. It just doesn't make sense, right? Like, if there's no, like, why not percentages? Why not fix the contract? I don't understand how this can still be a problem. This is the Santa Claus part. That's what I mean. I don't understand how that can possibly be possible. Oh, by the way, you should know that the Hoover allocation left exactly this much water for Native Americans. In the gallon allocation, Native American nations get exactly 0 gallons. Okay. 1931, we started building Hoover Dam. And a lot of people are surprised to hear that Hoover Dam was actually built for Southern California. Las Vegas was just getting started. So Hoover Dam was actually built for SoCal. Las Vegas sprouted right next to Hoover Dam because of the building of Hoover Dam, probably. I mean, it grew a lot because of the building of Hoover Dam. But it was not, Hoover Dam was never dedicated to Las Vegas. Las Vegas has just grown right next to it. And in case you're curious, it's built in a canyon called the Black Canyon. Something about the color of the sandstone there is black sandstone. They poured the first concrete in 1933, and they finished it, started filling in 1935. I want everybody to think about that. Hoover Dam at the time was the largest project in the history of humanity. It's since been eclipsed by 2 bigger dams. But Hoover Dam was the biggest thing ever built, at that time. The most concrete, the most workers, the most investment, the most engineers. The tallest thing, the widest thing, whatever. It was like the biggest building. And look how long it took to build it. 4 years. Anybody ever had like a kitchen renovation that took more than 4 years? Like when my mom remodeled her kitchen, it took about 4 years.
To do the freeway.
I mean, like doing the freeway, like adding a lane on 101, that's like a decade.
That's wrong.
Yeah, and it may never finish if Mr. Police gets his way. What's that?
There's so much you could say about that.
I'm not getting into it. I mean to say that how could they not finish a lane of the freeway, which is like a couple lawnmowers, then a bulldozer, then some asphalt? Okay, some pipes, I don't know. And then the largest thing ever built in the 30s took 4 years.
In the 30s.
Like in the 30s, we're talking like Model Ts and stuff. Like, I mean, it's not like fancy engineering. Did they do that in 4 years? You guys have to understand. You guys know why 1931 to 1935 is an important number? Yeah, it's also known as the Great Depression. So this is exactly where we have to get into history a little bit. This is an important story. All over the world, everybody studies the Colorado River. Hoover Dam was the great American hope during the Great American Depression. Keep in mind, it was a giant federal project to provide employment for millions of people, or many thousands of people, and it would offer a giant public good to support development, cheap electricity and cheap water. That was a win-win-win scenario. Many people say that Hoover Dam took the United States out of the Great Depression. Because if you didn't benefit directly from getting a job or electricity or water, you could at least say, well, they did it in Nevada, why can't we do that in Oregon? So Oregon started building dams. And Utah was like, wait, we've got rivers, why don't we start building dams? Everybody has to know this. Hoover Dam historically was the first glimmer of hope in the Great Depression. And ever since then, people have been trying to copy that glory. Samantha, can you hold that door open for me? Started in 31, concrete started in 33, finished in 1935, creating cheap electricity, cheap water. The biggest electrical generator in the world, by the way. That was the most electricity ever made in one place. And America said, look, we see how we can invest our way out of the Great Depression. This was the cure-all. America found the holy grail. Cheap water makes cheap food. Cheap electricity makes productivity for the economy. And that leads to global competitiveness. I don't know how much you guys know about American history, but these were some really dark days for America. And we solved all the problems. Use federal tax dollars to support the economy through cheap electricity and to support our public through jobs and cheap food because of the cheap water. Wham, 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 wham. So in the next 20 years, the United States built more than 100 dams. By 1955, we had put 55 dams on one river alone. This one, the Columbia. By now, it has almost 90 on one river. Because everybody figured it out. They're like, I want a dam. We pay taxes. Can we get some federal dollars? But something else happened in 1956. Remember that river I just told you about, the Columbia, that had 55 in 1955? By 1956, there was a really scary research project. Somebody asked fishermen, like, hey, how's it going fishing salmon? And in 1956, we measured a 90% decline in salmon numbers. 9-0. The previous 20 years of dam building had basically killed the biggest salmon river on Earth. The Columbia River was historically the largest salmon run on the planet. And because we built 55 dams in 20 years, in 1956, we measured a 90% decline in the Columbia salmon population. Yeah.
What's the policy for privately owned dams? Because people were asking for federal money to build dams. Can you build it privately on your own private property, like an industrial size?
I doubt that your private property could hold an industrial size. And separately, rivers are not part of your property. You own the land, not the water.
Okay. Do you have to ask for the permission, or do you have to ask for the money?
I don't know what the deal was in the 30s to the 50s.
Okay. What about now?
Now, nobody owns the water. Not in the river. That's public. That's a public good. So nobody but the federal government can manage the public good. There are state-managed rivers and federally managed rivers, but they're not private goods. You can build small reservoirs in your land, so there must be a way to capture surface water. But I don't think that would be mapped as a river. I think.
I just want to know if it was a profitable industry, if it was all been done.
These are public goods. The construction might have been profitable, but the dams were leasing the water from the government. All right. The reason 1956 is such a big year is because that's when we started to notice the dark side of the American dream of the 1930s. It's like, hey, look, we can build our way out of all of our problems and make cheap water for farming and make cheap electricity for business, and this sounds like a really good deal. And on the other hand, we can't give up all of our salmon. That's not a really good deal. Y'all feel me on that? 1956 was also a milestone because that's when they started building what is probably the last mega dam. In 1956, they started construction of Glen Canyon Dam. That's Lake Powell, which is really ironic because Powell wanted the river to run wild and they named the reservoir after him. It's like naming your new missile the Gandhi bomb. He argued for the wild river, and so they named the reservoir after him.
It was called the
Glen Canyon Dam, because it's a dam in Glen Canyon. You name the dam after the canyon, and then you name the reservoir after a person, usually. Yeah.
Is that the dam with like the most sediment buildup?
As a matter of fact, it is. Yeah. And the most evaporation. Fun fact about Lake Powell, it's not built for water at all. It's not for irrigation. It's entirely for electricity. So they started filling it here in 1963. And fun fact, Lake Powell evaporates twice the Los Angeles water budget annually. You know, we were talking about evaporation yesterday. It's a lot to evaporate.
Obviously, like that's wasteful, but doesn't the water go into the atmosphere and ultimately get drained down again?
Yeah, but not necessarily into that watershed. And so there is no loss of water globally. Nobody's worried about the planet leaking water.
But it seems like since we utilize like all water we have, naturally there might be less evaporation than there should be, and so like things like that would replenish.
We don't actually use any of that water. The water is just flowing from one place to another. There's no place that it doesn't show up another. The question is, does it show up where you want it to, or does it show up as rainfall in a place where you don't? Anybody else? Is there another question? I saw a hand. Yeah.
Well, does it not get wasted sometimes when it gets like dirty and like?
This is what we mean about the water supply. It's either where you want it, in a place where you can use it and it's clean and usable, or it's wasted in the sense that it evaporates to another system where you don't get to harness it, or wasted in the sense that its quality deteriorates. Water doesn't leak. It doesn't stop being water. It just changes into forms or areas where it's not useful to us. Yeah?
Does that like contribute to climate change where the water will warm up closer to rather than like evaporating?
In many ways, water is involved in climate change, and we'll talk about that a lot in the next unit. Okay. I'm sorry, but I've lost a lot of momentum today, and we do have to finish. There's other assignments after this today, and we still have to get these other dates. So in 1967, they finished a couple of the smaller dams here, the Yuma Dam, and a couple of others. 1967 was the first time that we could block all the water. In 1967, not a drop of water went across the border to Mexico, making that the first time that any river was entirely controlled by humans. We completely shut down the Colorado River. Not a drop went across the border. At that time, we had 10 dams on the Colorado. We now have 11. That's also the year that the Sierra Club won. I went out of order a little bit. Please look up. I just told you about 67. In 66, we started construction on 2 dams, the last 2 attempts, Marble Canyon and Bridge Canyon. So look, we started Marble Canyon and Bridge. Please look up. Started Marble Canyon Bridge. First time we controlled the entire Colorado River. And that was also the year that the Sierra Club successfully blocked all new construction on the Colorado. 67. So we abandoned Marble and Bridge Canyon, the one that started in 66. They were blocked in 67. And that was the end of big dam building in the U.S.
This is on the Colorado River.
Yeah.
What was the end of one?
Major dam building.
Stopped because we ran out of space or because of environmental.
Because of environmental concern, yeah, because of environmental issues. Now, Lyndon Johnson pulled off one more large water project in 1969, LBJ. Funded the last major federal water project. It's called the Central Arizona Project. Please look up. It took water from the lower Colorado and pumped it uphill to central Arizona. Tucson, Phoenix, and Scottsdale. This was the last major investment in moving Colorado River water. 1969, the Central Arizona Water Project by LBJ. After this, it's sort of the end of the dam building era. But there was something that happened in 1983 that was really important. 1983 was a really snowy winter followed by a really hot, wet spring. So 1983 was the most rapid and voluminous snowmelt ever. It was the most snowmelt ever recorded in the Colorado in spring. So the Glen Canyon Dam almost blew out. They were worried that it was going to overflow over the top. They were getting too much input. They had actually planned for a drought, and then they got way more snow than they expected, or way more runoff than they expected. So it was full, and all the rivers keep feeding it, and they're like, we can't dump the water. So they used all of the bypass tunnels. They used all of the turbine tunnels. They turned off and removed the turbines and just opened them up to just let the water flow as quickly as possible. Boulders damaged the tunnels as they tumbled through, and there was a lot of concrete fractures, and people started to freak out. Everybody thought it was going to blow. Keep in mind that Glen is kind of high. So if Glen Canyon goes, then there was fear that the water would flood and start blowing out the lower dams. So people were like freaking out. They opened up all the valves on all the dams to just let the water out of the Colorado. That year, a bunch of water hit Mexico. And after the flood subsided, they started to repair all the dams. But you know what else they noticed? That summer was one of the most successful ecologically in the history of the Colorado. You see, when you dump all the water out, you move all the sediment again. You know how faster moving water can carry more stuff, like your mom? They get the water flowing, which means the sediment is delivered, and the Colorado River explodes. Rare plants come back, fish populations go up, the birds start visiting, all the amphibians have a really good reproductive year. 1983 was a really close call, really scary, but also highlighted the importance of sediment transport. The last 30 years, we've been trying to figure out how to do that again.
Do it again without damaging the dams and making expensive.
Right, and without sacrificing the economic potential. You see, we had water to waste that year. Now the question is, how can we get sediment transport without giving up the economic functionality of the water holding? So now we get to the present. Nowadays, we don't build big dams. We stopped in 1967, as I told you earlier. Nowadays, we have better weather forecasting, so we don't usually get surprise, scary floods. Nowadays, we realize that dams are not a really good idea. We are mostly taking down dams now. As a nation, our dam count is going downward, not upward anymore. Globally, the only places that are still building dams are the developing world. But nowadays, I've got a sad story to tell you about the Sea of Cortez. This is an extremely unique issue. This is a one place in the planet where this happens. There's only one place on Earth where there is this issue. Please look up. The Sea of Cortez, known as the Gulf of California, is the longest gulf on the planet. It's more than 1,000 miles. That water comes in warm to begin with, because this is the tropics. So you start with tropical water. Yes?
What defines a Gulf?
Land on three sides. 1, 2, 3, go from Mexico. This body of water starts with hot water, but watch what happens, because it's in a really unique place. The Sea of Cortez is in the rain shadow of the lower California range. So any moisture left in the Pacific at this point, if you do get storms that are bringing moisture off the ocean, they leave that moisture in these mountains. So technically, by the time the air reaches the Gulf of California, that's one of the driest deserts on Earth. It's really windy, it's really sunny, it's really hot, it's really dry, and it's really far from open water. So this is what I mean about the Sea of Cortez being unique. This is the saltiest water in the world's oceans anywhere. There are blocked off seas that are saltier, like the Great Salt Lake and the Salton Sea and Mono Lake and the Dead Sea. But of the open ocean water, this is the saltiest water anywhere. Now, before we built our dams, that was balanced by an annual flood of snowmelt coming out of the Colorado watershed. So you would have saltier, 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 stagnant water for 6 months, and then this giant flood of fresh water, which would stir up the content in the Sea of Cortez and make these seasonal bursts of productivity, just like the Arctic Ocean. Remember we talked about that? The boom and bust cycle of productivity? Except unlike the Arctic, this is warm water to begin with. So you know how everybody migrates to the North Pole or the South Pole to get that burst of productivity in the northern summer and the southern summer, respectively? Well, the Sea of Cortez has these giant open ocean migrations. Manta ray, sailfin, dorado, gray whales. They all come into the Sea of Cortez to take advantage of that seasonal spike in productivity. Until about 30 years ago that we started to cock-block the water and not let the Colorado hit the Sea of Cortez anymore. For the last 30 years, the last 40 years, there's been these consistent reductions in productivity. Our Colorado River habits have been strangling this fishery for about 40 years now. If any of you have grandma, grandpa, mom, dad that used to fish in the Sea of Cortez, I'll bet you money they'll all tell you used to be really good 40 years ago. It's been getting hammered by overfishing, so it's a mix of problems. But one of the big problems is that overall productivity has suffered as we in the Southwest have taken up that water that would rejuvenate the Sea of Cortez every year. Yeah,
Colorado River's filled up right there.
you can see it. Students, that was number 36, which was assignment 8.4. Are there any questions about those years of the Colorado River story? Because I still have 8 minutes and I plan to use them.
What, 1857?
That was the year that Joseph Ives mapped from the edges and said it was impassable. Yeah.
What was 1963?
We started filling Lake Powell.
Oh, no.
And if anybody else has questions about the years, you can just check the video or ask your friends. Any questions about what I said instead of what it was that I said? All right. So we got to get back to the notes where we left off yesterday. I think we just finished talking about Three Gorges yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now look. I promise you, I want to get through every study goal, but we got a lot left in like a day and 8 minutes. So we went all the way through 23 yesterday. 24 was channelization. We've talked about that. 25 was history of the Colorado. I folded that into today's lecture. 26 was biological oxygen demand. We've done that. 27 was coliform bacteria. We've done that. 28 was eutrophication. We've done that. 29, very quickly if I may, how do we avoid oil tanker accidents? I'm assuming you did your homework. Number 1, double hold boats. And number 2, rerouting them. But I wanted to give you an interesting example which is perfectly timed today. The Santa Barbara Channel is considered ecologically and economically sensitive, so we don't put oil tankers in the channel. Except tonight and tomorrow. You see, we route oil tankers around the Channel Islands, outside the Channel Islands, to protect our fisheries and our coastline. Except when it's too stormy and dangerous for that. Then we bring them in through the channel to keep them safe. So if you notice a break in the storm, and you get a chance to look out into the channel from up high, like Camino Cielo or Gibraltar or something, take a look. Look at the end of the channel, like right in front of the island, so to speak. On the far side of the channel, you may see some large oil tankers coming through the Santa Barbara Channel because it's stormy weather outside right now. And it's getting stormier. Anybody know what the buoys are doing right now?
Firing.
Yeah. Yeah, starting to fire, yeah. All right. So I'd like to do at least number 30 in our last 5 minutes. This was yesterday's warm-up. Number 30 was yesterday's warm-up, how sedimentation is a twofold problem. And I need you to write something down because students always get confused. Trust me, you'll want this in there. Take my word for it. Number 30, write this down, is not about dams. You see, so far, I have discussed sediment issues relevant to dams, how dams block the sediment and fill up with sediment and rob sediment downriver. But not dams. We also need to talk about how sediment is actually a type of pollution as well. This is called sedimentation. Number 30 is sediment as pollution, not about dams. So, when I say pollution, I mean the number one water pollutant by volume and by weight. Sediment is the primary water pollutant on Earth. Sediment comes from 5 human activities: logging, agriculture, construction, mining, and dirt roads. And maybe you remember the warm-up yesterday. I said it's a twofold problem. Anybody know how it's a twofold problem? What's the first problem? The erosion, that you've lost dirt somewhere. That's the problem on land. You know, you gave up your dirt. So the forest won't grow, or you can't grow food because the farm's out of dirt. The second problem is the buildup of sediment in the rivers. And that causes 5 buildup problems. Number 1, you choke canals, which causes flooding. Number 2, you bury vegetation, which lowers productivity. Number 3, it makes water hotter because the water is more dark. So by making it darker, it heats up more. Fourth, you block sunlight, which again lowers productivity. And the final problem of sediment buildup is that you bury the eggs of fish, amphibians, and insects. All of these like to lay their eggs in little pockets in the rocks. Little rock pockets.
How does it block sunlight?
Say again now?
How does it block sunlight?
You know, because you've added murk to water. So water is otherwise clear, now it's murkiness. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page before you pack it up. We did 36 first. That was assignment 8.4. Then we went back to backfill some empty study goals. And just to be clear, the one we just finished was number 30, with some facts about sediment as a pollutant, not dam stuff. Are there any questions for me?
Oh, what's the warm-up for H2O2?
We'll do that tomorrow.
Is it H2O2 though?
No.